She had not meant to be there. That was the truth Lena Ashwood would carry with her for the rest of her life. The simple, unglamorous fact that none of what followed had been planned or sought or desired. She had gone to the lower archives because the third cataloging ledger for the reign of Aldrich II had been misfiled somewhere between the eastern wing and the restricted vault, and Elder Tomlin would have her reassigned to laundry duty if she did not produce it before the morning bell. That was all. She had gone for a ledger. She had found the end of the world as she knew it. The lower archives sat beneath the east tower of Vorn Palace, accessible through a narrow stone corridor that smelled permanently of dust and old candle wax. At this hour, well past the third evening bell, no one came here. The scribes had long since retired. The scholars did not work by torchlight. Only Lena moved through these corridors with any regularity after dark, because she had learned years ago that the palace was quietest in the hours when everyone else slept, and quiet was the only luxury available to a woman of her station. She carried a single tallow candle and her own heartbeat for company, and she was perfectly content with both. She found the ledger on the wrong shelf, tucked between two volumes on migratory patterns of the lesser ridgeback hawks, which was typical of Elder Tomlin's filing system and entirely predictable. She pulled it free, tucked it under her arm, and was turning back toward the corridor when she heard the voices. Not loud voices. Not the kind that carry without intention. These were deliberate whispers, the sort that men use when they are saying things that cannot be unsaid in any other register. And Lena had enough experience with the palace to know immediately that she had stumbled into something she was not meant to witness. She should have left. Every instinct she had cultivated over 7 years of careful, invisible service told her to snuff her candle, press herself against the shelves, and wait until the voices passed. She was good at waiting. She was good at being nothing, at occupying space without filling it, at moving through the palace like a shadow that the light had simply forgotten to chase away. She could have waited them out. She should have. But one of the voices said the king's name in a tone that made her blood go cold, and the word that followed was poison. And Lena Ashwood, archivist, daughter of nobody, woman of no consequence whatsoever, found that her feet had made a decision her mind was still arguing about. She stepped closer, just close enough to hear. The archival shelves in this section were arranged in a double row, creating a narrow corridor between them, and the men on the other side had no idea the shelves were not a solid wall. There were 2 of them. She could not see their faces. She could hear their words with terrible clarity, each one landing in her chest like a stone dropped into still water. The conclave. The king's wine. A particular morning, 3 days hence. A name she recognized as belonging to one of the high lords of the northern reaches. Another name she did not recognize at all, spoken with the careful neutrality of someone who has practiced not reacting to it. She was still processing the full architecture of what she was hearing when her elbow caught the edge of a shelf, and the ledger slipped, and the sound it made when it struck the stone floor was, in the absolute silence of the lower archives at that hour, approximately as subtle as a thunderclap. The voices stopped. There was a single heartbeat of silence. Then footsteps, fast and deliberate, rounding the end of the shelf row, and Lena had just enough time to register the face of Lord Harwick Dren before his hand closed around her wrist with a grip that left no room for interpretation. "Well," Lord Dren said quietly, and his voice was the most frightening thing she had ever heard because it was completely calm. "This is inconvenient." She did not scream. She thought about it. She assessed the probability of anyone hearing her in these lower halls at this hour and found it wanting. She thought about the ledger on the floor, and Elder Tomlin and laundry duty, and she thought, with the strange crystalline clarity that fear sometimes produces, that none of that mattered now. What mattered was that Lord Harwick Dren, 3rd seat of the Northern Council, and a man who had twice been rumored to make problems disappear with quiet efficiency, was holding her wrist and looking at her with the expression of someone doing a calculation. "I did not hear anything," Lena said. Her voice was steady. She was proud of that. "I came for a ledger. I dropped it. I am leaving." "You heard everything," Lord Dren said. "You are not stupid. I can see that you are not stupid, which is precisely the problem." The second man had come around the shelf now. She did not know him. He was broad and, wore traveling clothes and looked at her with the blank assessment of a man accustomed to assessing problems. Lena understood, with the part of her mind that was still working while the rest of it was engaged in something very close to panic, that she had perhaps 3 seconds to change the nature of this encounter before it became something she could not recover from. "If anything happens to me," she said, "my supervisor knows I am here. I told him I was coming for the 3rd cataloging ledger of Aldrich II's reign. He will come looking when I do not return." This was entirely untrue. Elder Tomlin was asleep and would not notice her absence until morning. But Lord Dren did not know that. The calculation behind his eyes shifted slightly. Not enough. Not nearly enough. But the second man put a hand on Dren's arm and murmured something she could not hear. And in the half-second that Dren's attention moved, Lena pulled her wrist free with a sharp backward twist she had learned from the Palace Guard's training manual, which she had catalogued and accidentally memorized 2 winters ago. She ran. She did not run gracefully or strategically. She ran the way small animals run when large ones are behind them, which is to say with absolute commitment and no regard for dignity. She went up through the corridor, and up the East Tower stairs, and through the main gallery, and did not stop until she was standing outside the doors of the king's study, breathing hard, with a guard, staring at her as though she had lost her mind. "I need to speak with the king," she said. The guard looked at her. She was a small woman in archivist's gray with ink stains on her fingers and dust from the lower shelves on her shoulder, and the expression of someone who had recently made a decision they could not take back. The guard's expression conveyed, eloquently and without words, that this was not going to happen. "It is about a plot against his life," Lena said, "occurring in 3 days. During the conclave." The guard's expression changed. She was inside within the minute. If you are enjoying this story, do not forget to leave a like and subscribe to the channel for more emotional stories like this one. The king's study was nothing like the paintings. This was the first thing Lena noticed, because she had catalogued the official portraits of this room twice, and she had always assumed a certain amount of artistic license had been taken with the grandeur. But the room was genuinely grand, genuinely vast, lit by a fireplace large enough to roast an ox and lined with bookshelves that made her archivist's heart perform a complicated leap of longing, even in the middle of a crisis. And standing at the far end of it, still dressed from whatever evening engagement he had recently left, was King Cassian Vorn. She had seen him at distance. Every palace servant had. He was not a man who disappeared into crowds, not at that height, not with the quality of stillness he carried. He had the kind of face that history remembered, all sharp angles and considered lines, and eyes the exact color of storm clouds before they broke, a gray so dark it read almost black in low light. He was looking at her with the focused attention of a man who had learned long ago that most things brought before him at this hour were either crises or elaborate attempts to manufacture proximity to power, and who had developed a precise and rather exhausting ability to distinguish between the two. Beside him, perched on the high back of his chair, was the eagle. Lena had seen illustrations. Every child in the Vorn kingdoms had seen illustrations. The royal eagle of the Vorn line was not precisely an eagle in the way that the common birds of the field were eagles. It was larger, first of all, considerably larger. Its wingspan, when extended, could shadow a man completely. Its feathers were the deep, burnished gold of old coin, with white at the primary flight feathers and a head of pure white that gave it the appearance of wearing a crown. Its eyes were amber, and they were ancient, and they were, at this precise moment, fixed on Lena with an intensity that made the hair on her arms rise. She had been told, somewhere in her reading, that the royal eagle chose its moments of attention carefully, that it watched most people with the polite disinterest of a creature that had seen centuries pass, that it had not, in living memory, or in the recorded memory of the archivists before her, shown particular interest in anyone who was not of royal blood or extraordinarily high station. The eagle was staring at her as if she were the most interesting thing it had seen in a very long time. "You have information about a plot against my life," the king said. His voice was exactly as it was described in the histories, low, measured, with the particular quality of someone who had learned to speak in a way that rooms listened to. "Tell me." So she told him. She told him everything, clearly and in order, because she was an archivist, and order was what she did. She told him about the ledger, and the wrong shelf, and the voices, and the words she had heard, and Lord Dren's hand on her wrist, and the name she had recognized, and the name she had not. She told him about running, and the guard, and standing here now. She kept her voice steady. She kept her hands still. She looked at a point slightly to the left of his face, because looking directly at him felt like staring into something she had not been prepared for, and she had enough problems tonight without adding that one. When she finished, the room was quiet for a moment. Then the eagle made a sound. Not a screech, not the territorial cry of birds in the field. A sound lower than that, almost musical, that seemed to come from somewhere deep in its chest, and it shifted on the chair back, and it leaned forward, and it dipped its great white head toward her in a motion that Lena's well-read mind recognized. Immediately, and could not, for a moment, reconcile with reality, the eagle bowed, not dramatically, not with the theatrical sweep of a performer. A single deliberate inclination of that crowned head, unmistakable in its meaning, aimed at her. A woman in archivist's gray with ink on her fingers and dust on her shoulder. The king went very still. "That," he said, after a pause that felt geological in its weight, "has not happened before." "I am aware," Lena said, because she had catalogued the records, and she knew it was true, and she did not know what else to say. He looked at her for a long time after that. Not with the assessing calculation of Lord Dren, not with the dismissive glance of a man categorizing a servant. He looked at her the way she sometimes looked at a document she had not expected to find, the way she looked at something that rearranged her understanding of what she thought she knew. "What is your name?" he asked. "Lena Ashwood, Your Majesty. Third Archivist, Easta. Wing." "Ashwood," he repeated. Something crossed his face, brief and controlled, but she caught it, because she was very good at reading the details that other people missed. "You will be given quarters in the secure wing tonight. My guards will want your full account in writing. You will not return to your regular duties until this matter is resolved. My supervisor will need to be informed," she said. "He will have questions about the ledger." The king blinked. It was the closest thing to surprise she had seen on his face. "I will have someone handle Elder Tomlin," he said. And there was something in the way he said it, the faintest shift at the corner of his mouth, that was not quite a smile but existed in the same general territory. "You are dismissed, Miss Ashwood. A guard will escort you." She nodded. She turned to go. She was almost at the door when the eagle cried out again, that same low sound, and she felt the air from its wings on the back of her neck, and turned to find it had flown from the chair and landed on the bookshelf nearest to her, at eye level, its amber gaze level with hers, its head tilted with what she could only describe as curiosity. She stood very still. She had no idea what the protocol was for this situation. She was fairly certain no protocol existed. Very slowly, without knowing why she did it, she raised one hand, palm upward, the way you offered a hand to a creature you wanted to approach you. The eagle looked at her hand, looked at her face, and then, with the deliberate grace of something that understood ceremony, it stepped from the shelf onto her wrist, settled its considerable weight on her arm, and folded its wings. She heard the king's sharp intake of breath from across the room. The eagle had not left the palace's upper chambers willingly in 40 years. That night changed everything, though Lena would not understand the full scope of the change for some time. She was installed in a comfortable room in the secure wing, with a guard at the door, and a meal she barely touched, and a sleepless night in which she replayed every moment of the lower archives and every moment in the king's study, and arrived, repeatedly, at the image of the eagle on her wrist, and had no framework for what to do with it. She was a woman who solved problems through research and documentation. She located appropriate sources and cross-referenced them, and arrived at defensible conclusions. She could not cross-reference the feeling of those talons on her arm, light as feathers and solid as certainty, or the amber gaze that had looked at her as if it recognized something she did not yet know about herself. By morning, Lord Dren and his companion had been apprehended. The guards had moved with the efficiency of men who had been given clear orders and clear information. There was no fanfare, no announcement, no public drama. The palace absorbed it, as the palace absorbed most things, quietly and with a minimum of visible disruption. Lena was informed of this by a young guard captain named Aldrich, who delivered the news with the careful neutrality of a man who had been told not to ask questions he could not be given answers to, and she thanked him and asked when she would be permitted to return to her duties. Captain Aldrich looked at her with the expression of a man who has been given instructions that make more sense now than they did when he received them. His Majesty has requested your continued presence in the secure wing, he said. You are to be available for further consultation. Further consultation lasted 3 days. 3 days in which the king did not summon her again, but in which she caught twice the shadow of the eagle in the corridor outside her door, moving with silent purpose, disappearing when she opened the door to look. 3 days in which she was given access to a small reading room with shelves of books that were not from the standard archival collection. Older books. Books she had never seen before. Books whose titles made something in her chest respond with a recognition that she found deeply unsettling. 3 days in which she read about the Guardians. She had known the Guardians existed the way she knew most historical things existed, as entries in ledgers, as footnotes in the margins of more important texts, as a chapter in a history of the early Vorn kingdoms that she had catalogued without reading closely. The Order of the Eagle Guardians had been founded in the reign of the first Vorn king, a bond between the royal bloodline and a separate line of women chosen by the eagle itself to serve as its human counterparts, its living link to the world outside the palace. The Guardians had been healers and scholars and advisors, women of particular perception and particular power, and the bond between a guardian and the eagle had been considered one of the most sacred connections in the kingdom's history. The last guardian had died without naming a successor 112 years ago, and the order had simply ended, unmourned in the formal records, because there had been no one left to mourn it. On the morning of the 4th day, the king summoned her. He was at his desk when she was shown in, working, and he did not look up immediately, which she appreciated, because it gave her a moment to compose herself before those storm-gray eyes found her face. The eagle was on its perch in the corner of the room, and it raised its head when she entered and made the soft sound she had come to recognize, the one she now associated with something like greeting. "You have been reading," the king said. He said it not as an accusation, but as an observation, the way someone notes a fact they find interesting. "You gave me access to books," she said. "I read books. That is what I do." Something moved in his expression again. She was becoming better at reading those movements. "What did you find?" "I found a great deal about the Guardians," she said, carefully. "About the criteria for their selection. About the nature of the bond. About what it means when the eagle chooses someone." She paused. I found references to certain bloodlines that were believed to carry a latent affinity for the eagle's recognition, even across generations of dormancy. Bloodlines that could be traced through the maternal line. Another pause. My mother's family name was Ashenvale. The king set down his pen. I know, he said. She looked at him. You knew before I did. I suspected, he said. When you told me your name that first night. The Ashenvale line was documented. I did not want to tell you before you had the chance to arrive at it yourself. He said this without apology, but with a quality of care that she had not expected. A deliberateness that suggested he had thought about it and made a choice he considered respectful. The knowledge is yours. It should not have been delivered to you like a decree. She sat with that for a moment. Outside, through the window, she could hear the sounds of the palace going about its mourning. The guard change, the distant kitchen bells, the ordinary machinery of a world that was continuing while she sat in the king's study and understood that her entire understanding of herself had just been revised. What does it mean? She asked. Practically. For my situation? Practically, he said. It means that the eagle has chosen a guardian for the first time in a century, and that the conclave is in 4 days, and that there is a ceremony prescribed in the founding documents of this kingdom that has not been performed in living memory. He looked at her steadily. It means that what you do next will be very public, and will cause considerable disruption to a number of people who have invested heavily in a particular vision of how things will proceed. She understood what he meant. She had not been in the palace for 7 years without understanding its social architecture. She knew who Lady Seraphine Crest was. Everyone knew who Lady Seraphine Crest was. The daughter of the most powerful lord in the southern reaches, beautiful and politically brilliant, and positioned at the king's side with the careful precision of someone who had been groomed for exactly this position since childhood. The court had been waiting for the formal announcement of their betrothal for 2 seasons. It had not come yet, but everyone agreed it was a matter of timing, not intention. I am not asking you to disrupt anything, Lena said. I am an archivist. I catalogued the Guardian records and I understand what the eagle's recognition means ceremonially, but that does not change my station or my role or what is appropriate in terms of Lena, the king said. She stopped. He had not used her name before, not her given name. He had said it with the same deliberate quality he brought to everything, as if he had considered it carefully and decided it was the precise word he meant to use. The eagle does not make mistakes, he said. In 500 years of recorded history, it has never chosen incorrectly. The guardians were not selected by bloodline alone. They were selected by something I do not have a word for, that is not destiny. And I am a man who does not generally find that word useful. He paused. I am finding it increasingly difficult to dismiss. She did not say anything. There was nothing to say that would not either diminish what he meant or overstep what she was permitted to claim. There are people in this court, he continued, who will not receive this well. I want you to understand that before the conclave. I want you to understand what will be asked of you and to make a choice that is genuinely yours, not one made in the confusion of 3 days in a secure room, having only had access to the texts I selected. I have been in your palace for 7 years, she said. I have been invisible for 7 of them. I am not confused about what this court is. He looked at her for a long time. No, he said quietly. I do not think you are. What do you think will happen next? Leave your predictions in the comments below. Lady Seraphine Crest came to her on the 2nd day after that meeting, and Lena gave her full marks for the precision of the timing, which suggested either excellent information networks or an instinct for political vulnerability that was genuinely impressive. Lena was in the small reading room, transcribing her official account of the archival incident for the royal record, when the door opened without a knock, and the most beautiful woman she had ever seen walked in and looked at her with the composed, pleasant expression of someone who has prepared thoroughly for a conversation they intend to win. Seraphine was everything Lena was not, and she wore it the way some women wore jewels, as an extension of power rather than mere decoration. She was tall, where Lena was middling, polished where Lena was practical, draped in silk, the color of deep water, where Lena was in her archival gray. Her hair was the particular shade of dark auburn that painters spent careers trying to capture, and her eyes were green and watchful, and framed by the kind of bone structure that suggested several generations of careful selection. She sat down across from Lena without being invited, and folded her hands on the table and smiled. "Miss Ashwood," she said, "how extraordinary that we have never been formally introduced, given how long you have been in the palace." "I am an archivist," Lena said. "We are not generally in the same rooms as the nobility." "No," Seraphine agreed pleasantly. "You are not. Which makes the current situation rather remarkable, does it not?" She tilted her head, the gesture of a woman accustomed to the rhetorical high ground. "I want you to understand that I bear you no ill will. You could not have anticipated what occurred in the archives, and the eagle's behavior, while unusual, is something that the scholars will certainly have explanations for in time." "I am sure they will," Lena said. "What concerns me," Seraphine continued, in the tone of a woman sharing a confidence, "is that you may have been placed in a position that is ultimately harmful to you. The court is a complicated environment. People are already talking. There will be speculation, and speculation in this court has a way of becoming cruel, particularly toward women who are perceived as having reached beyond their station." She paused. "I would not want to see you hurt." It was beautifully done. Lena recognized it as such. The framing was impeccable. It was not a threat. It was concern. It was not a dismissal. It was protection. It was the kind of warning that could not be argued with because arguing with it would require claiming to want the very outcomes being warned against. She had catalogued enough political correspondence to recognize the architecture of it. "That is very kind," Lena said. "I appreciate the concern." Seraphine studied her. Something shifted behind those green eyes, a slight recalibration. She had expected a different response, perhaps nervousness, perhaps gratitude, perhaps the eager reassurance of a woman who wanted to be liked by someone powerful. She had not expected the simple acknowledgement of someone who had heard what was being said beneath what was being said, and was choosing to leave it where it lay. "You are not what I expected," Seraphine said, and for the first time, the pleasantness in her voice was something closer to genuine. "I rarely am," Lena said. "Is there something I can help you with today? I have a great deal of transcription to finish." Seraphine left. She left with the grace of a woman who does not show when she is unsettled, which was perfect, and Lena waited until the door closed before she set down her pen and let herself breathe for a moment, because her hands had been perfectly steady throughout, and she was slightly amazed by that, and her heart was doing something complicated that she chose not to examine too carefully. The next several days were a study in the particular art of being visible when you have spent 7 years practicing invisibility. Word had spread, as word always spread in palaces, with the speed and thoroughness of water, finding the lowest point of any container. Every servant she passed in the corridor had a story in their eyes. Every scribe in the archival wing treated her with the careful deference of people who were not sure what she was now and were taking no risks. Elder Tomlin, who had received some communication from the king's office that he had not shared with her, but which had clearly reconfigured his understanding of several things, looked at her with the expression of a man who was doing rapid and uncomfortable arithmetic. She bore it all with the same quality she had brought to 7 years of invisibility, which was a kind of fundamental self-possession that had nothing to do with arrogance and everything to do with the simple practice of knowing what she thought and trusting it. She had been nobody's idea of remarkable for her entire life. She was not going to perform remarkability now that circumstances had imposed it on her. She was going to be exactly what she had always been, which was careful and thorough and honest, and she was going to see what that amounted to under different conditions. The eagle found her 3 more times in those days. Once in the corridor, outside the archival reading room, where it landed on a wall sconce and watched her pass with amber eyes that were warm, in a way she did not know bird eyes could be warm. Once in the garden, where she had gone for air and found it already there, perched on the stone railing, turning its head when she approached with the tilted curiosity she was beginning to recognize as its habitual expression around her. And once, most startling, it appeared in her window in the early morning, before the light had fully arrived, and sat on the sill and made the low musical sound that she had decided, privately, was the sound of it being pleased, until she got up and moved toward it, and it allowed her to place her hand on the warmth of its feathers, just briefly, just for a moment, before it spread those vast wings and rose back into the pre-dawn sky. Each time, she felt something. It was not precisely a feeling she had a name for. It was a warmth in her chest that moved upward through her. Something that activated along her spine and behind her eyes, like standing in sunlight after a long winter, like remembering something important that you had not known you had forgotten. She tried not to attach too much significance to it. She tried to think about it the way she thought about archival discoveries, as data to be noted and organized rather than experienced. She was not entirely successful. On the 3rd day before the conclave, the king asked to walk with her in the garden. He came without guards, which she noted. He wore no formal dress, just the dark coat of a man spending a private morning, and he fell into step beside her on the garden path with the air of someone who had decided to do something and was doing it without making more of it than it was. She matched his pace. The eagle was somewhere overhead. She could feel it, a sensation she had come to recognize as distinct from ordinary awareness, something that existed in the peripheral space just past ordinary perception. "I want to tell you something," he said. "Before the conclave, before the ceremony and everything it will set in motion." He was looking ahead at the path, not at her, which she found paradoxically made it easier to listen. "I have been king for 11 years. I took the throne young, in circumstances that required me to become a particular kind of person very quickly. Controlled, strategic, certain." He paused. "Certainty is useful in a king. It is less useful in a man." She waited. She was good at waiting. "I have spent 11 years making decisions based on what is necessary," he continued. "Political necessity, strategic necessity, the necessity of alliances and appearances and the preservation of stability. These are not wrong reasons. The kingdom requires them. But there are other kinds of necessity that I have been less attentive to." "What kind?" she asked. He was quiet for a moment. They passed the fountain, and the sound of the water was soft around them, and the eagle drifted. Overhead in a long, lazy circle that she tracked without lifting her eyes from the path. "The kind that has to do with what is real," he said finally. "What is genuine. What cannot be managed or strategized or positioned." He stopped walking, and she stopped with him, and he looked at her then, directly, with all that storm-gray focus. "You said something on the first night. You said you were leaving, that you had come for a ledger and you were leaving. You were not asking for anything. You were not positioning yourself. You were simply stating a fact, and it was the most honest thing anyone had said in that room in a very long time." She thought about it. "I had come for a ledger," she said. That was the truth. "Yes," he said. Something in his voice was careful and unguarded at the same time, a combination she had not heard from him before. "That is exactly the point." She stood in the garden with the morning around them and the eagle circling and the warmth in her chest, doing something complex and insistent, and she thought about 7 years of careful invisibility and the lower archives and the ledger on the floor and the weight of those amber eyes, And she thought about Seraphine's perfectly constructed concern, and Elder Tomlin's arithmetic, and every noble in the court, making rapid calculations. And she thought that what she wanted, more than anything, was to be exactly as honest in this moment as she had been in every other moment of her life. "I do not know how to do what is coming," she said. "I do not know how to be the guardian. I do not know how to stand in that ceremony and have the entire court watching me. I do not know how to be visible when I have spent my entire life learning how to be invisible." She paused. "I know how to read. I know how to find things that are lost. I know how to be in a room without disturbing it. And I know that that is not the same skill that is going to be required of me in 4 days." "No," he agreed. "It is not. But I know that the eagle chose me," she said. "And I know that I do not entirely understand why, but I have read enough history to understand that the why is not always the important question. Sometimes the important question is what you do with the choosing." She looked at him steadily. "So I am going to do what I always do when I encounter something I do not understand. I am going to read everything available on the subject, and I am going to approach it carefully, and I am going to be honest, and I am going to trust that those things are enough." The silence that followed was not the silence of a room waiting for a response. It was the silence of something settling, finding its level, the way water finds still after motion. "They will be enough," the king said. And then, more quietly, in a register that was not the king's voice, but simply his, "More than enough." She looked at him for a long moment. She thought about the way he had said her name. She thought about the careful deliberateness of it, the consideration. She thought about a man who had spent 11 years being certain and was in the process of discovering the limitations of certainty. And she thought that she understood that particular discovery perhaps better than he knew, because invisibility and certainty were different forms of the same defense. And she was standing here in a garden having dismantled hers entirely, and it was the most exposed she had ever felt, and also the most precisely exactly herself. "Thank you," she said, "for the room, and the books, and for telling me about the Ashen Veil line instead of announcing it." "You would have found it yourself," he said. "You are an archivist." "I would have," she agreed, "but it would have been lonelier." Something crossed his face then, a movement she recognized as the real thing, unguarded and unmanaged. And she turned back toward the path before she could do something inadvisable with the recognition of it, and they walked back to the palace in the particular companionable quiet of two people who have just told each other something true. If you want to see how this story ends, make sure you are subscribed with notifications on. Lady Seraphine's second approach was less pleasant than her first. Lena had expected this. Political operatives did not abandon their positions after a single unsuccessful overture. They recalibrated. Seraphine had 3 days to recalibrate, and she used them with precision and efficiency that Lena actually found herself admiring, even as she was navigating the effects of it. First, there was the matter of the court seamstresses. Lena had been told, through official channels, that she would need appropriate clothing for the conclave ceremony, and she had gone to the fitting rooms in the palace's western wing, with the reasonable expectation of being measured and provided with something suitable. Instead, she found that the head seamstress had received a communication suggesting that the standard guardian ceremonial attire was currently undergoing restoration and would not be available, and that the alternative designs available were, as it happened, deeply unflattering. Lena stood in the fitting room and looked at a succession of garments that managed to simultaneously suggest she was being dressed up and put in her place, and said, pleasantly, that she would require access to the archival records on guardian ceremonial dress, as she was confident the original specifications were documented. The seamstress blinked. Lena smiled. She went to the archives, found the documentation, and returned with it in hand. The head seamstress looked at the official archival notation and the Vorn royal seal on the cover, made a series of quiet internal calculations, and produce something entirely different. Then there was the matter of her quarters. She returned to her room in the secure wing on the second day before the conclave to find that there had been a clerical error, and her room had been reassigned, and the only available alternative was a small room near the laundry quarters. She nodded to the guard who informed her of this and went directly to Captain Aldrich and said that she needed to speak with him about a logistical matter, and Captain Aldrich looked at her with the expression of a man who was developing a considerable respect for her approach to things, and the clerical error was resolved within the hour. She did not report these incidents. She did not complain about them. She handled each one with the systematic thoroughness she brought to archival problems, locating the appropriate resource, applying the correct procedure, producing the necessary documentation, and moving on. She was not angry. She found, somewhat to her own surprise, that she was not even particularly distressed. She had spent 7 years watching the machinery of the court from the comfortable invisibility of the archival wing, and she had read enough court history to recognize every gambit being deployed against her, and knowledge of a thing, she had found, diminished its power considerably. What she was, underneath all of it, was tired. Tired in the way you are when something that you have been preparing for a long time without knowing you were preparing is finally arriving, and you want it to arrive, and you want it to be over, and you want to know what comes after, all at the same time. The days between Seraphine's visit and the eve of the conclave were an education in a kind of endurance Lena had not previously been required to practice. It was not the endurance of suffering, precisely. It was the endurance of being watched, which was its own distinct discipline, and one that she had not previously had occasion to develop. Every room she entered underwent a subtle reconfiguration as she crossed the threshold, conversations shifting in register, eyes finding her, and then finding other things to look at. The whole elaborate social machinery of the court, performing the calculations it could not help but perform when a known quantity was reclassified without warning. She understood all of it. She had catalogued the social histories of the kingdom with the same thoroughness she brought to everything, and she knew that what was happening was entirely predictable and not personal in any meaningful sense. The court was not cruel to her out of genuine hostility. It was uncertain, and uncertainty made most people careful, and careful people were often accidentally unkind. She did not hold it against them. She simply navigated it with the systematic attention she applied to all complex organizational problems, identified the parameters, mapped the obstacles, and proceeded. What was harder, and what she had not catalogued her way into being prepared for, was the growing awareness that her inner life was undergoing changes at a pace that did not leave adequate time for the thorough documentation she preferred. She was a woman who processed by writing things down, by finding the words that fit the shape of a thing and pinning it to the page where she could look at it from a reasonable distance and assess it calmly. She was discovering that some things did not submit to pinning. The warmth in her chest when she thought about the garden. The way the king's attention felt different from every other kind of attention she had received in her life, which was to say that it felt like being seen, rather than observed, a distinction she had thought was semantic, until she experienced both in close proximity and found it was not semantic at all. The eagle's presence, which she felt now even when it was not physically with her, a warmth in the background of her awareness like a fire in an adjacent room, present and reliable and quietly insistent. These things could be noted, but not organized, and she made her peace with that, one morning at a time, with the practicality she had always applied to problems that required acceptance rather than solutions. She was in the small reading room, the evening before the conclave, trying to hold the ceremony protocol in her head for the 7th time, and failing because her mind kept sliding to the king's voice in the garden and the warmth in her chest, and the particular problem of whether she was reading things correctly or constructing them out of her own wish for them to be true, when she heard the eagle in the corridor. She knew its sounds now. The soft bell-like note that meant greeting. The sharper note that meant something requiring attention. the low, resonant sound that meant it was settled and content. This was a different sound, one she had not heard before. A long musical phrase that seemed to wind through the air and arrive in her chest and pull at something there, something that responded to it the way iron responds to a lodestone. She went to the door. The eagle was in the corridor, and it looked at her when she opened the door with an expression she could only describe as purposeful, and it turned and walked, with the peculiar dignified deliberation of something that has a destination in mind, along the corridor and through a turning she had not previously explored, and she followed it, because she had learned to follow it, and because something in her recognized the pull of whatever it was leading her toward. It led her to a room she had not known existed. Behind a door without markings, down a short stair, a small circular chamber with walls of old stone and a single window open to the night sky. The room was empty except for an old wooden stand, and, on the stand, a book. Not a book from the standard collection. Older than those. The kind of old that exists before cataloging systems, before the impulse to organize and annotate. The cover was plain worn leather, and the title had been pressed into it without ink, just the depression of the letters themselves, readable only when you held it. At an angle to the light. The Guardians. Their bond. Their purpose. Their promise. She sat on the floor with her back against the stone wall, and the eagle on the stand beside her, looking over her shoulder with amber eyes, and she read the whole of it by the light of a single candle, and by the time she finished she understood things that all the other reading had been approaching, but never quite arriving at, the way you can know the facts of something for a long time before you understand the truth of it. The Guardians were not merely ceremonial. They were not selected for bloodline alone, though the bloodline was part of it. They were selected for perception, the specific quality of being able to see what others overlooked, of being present in a room without consuming it, of registering the truth of things beneath the surface of them. They were selected for steadiness, the ability to be with difficulty without being diminished by it. And they were selected, most importantly, for what the old text called a quality of the heart, which it described with patient care as the capacity to receive love without fleeing from it, which it had found, across centuries of looking, to be among the rarest attributes in any person of any station. She sat with that for a long time after she finished reading. The eagle made the settled sound. The candle burned low. Outside the window, the stars of the night before the conclave were extraordinarily clear, as if the sky had cleaned itself. For the occasion. She thought about receiving love without fleeing from it, and she thought about the garden and the king's voice and the warmth in her chest that she had been trying not to name, and she thought that she was sitting in a stone room reading about herself, and that it was both the strangest and the most natural thing that had happened to her in a very strange and natural several days. She went back to her room, and she slept, deeply and well, for the first time in 2 weeks. 3. Morning of the conclave arrived with the kind of weather that seemed to have been informed of its own significance. Bright and cold and clear, with a wind that moved through the palace courtyards with purpose, lifting banners and stirring the formal gardens into motion. Lena stood at her window and watched the nobles arriving in their procession, the silks and the feathers and the carefully arranged faces of people who had prepared for this day, according to their own designs. And she thought about Lord Dren in the lower archives saying that something was inconvenient. And she thought that she agreed with him, though not in the way he had meant. She dressed in the Guardian's ceremonial white, which was not the white of innocence or surrender, but the white of clarity, of light at its source before it separates into color, according to the old text. And she thought that was a useful thing to know about a garment you were putting on. The seamstress had followed the archival specifications precisely, and the result was something that did not ask to be admired, but was impossible to overlook, fitted simply to the lines of her actual body, rather than the idealized body of court fashion, with embroidery at the cuffs and collar in the old style that she now recognized as the eagle's flight pattern rendered in thread. Captain Aldrich came to escort her to the ceremonial hall, and he looked at her with the expression of a man who was seeing something in its proper context. For the first time, and said nothing, which she appreciated more than any compliment would have been. The ceremonial hall of Vorn Palace was the oldest part of the building, predating the current structure by several centuries, its walls made of the original stone of the first keep, and its ceiling painted with images she recognized now from the Guardian texts. Images of the eagle in various aspects of its nature. The young eagle choosing, the eagle in flight, the eagle at rest with its guardian, the eagle at the end of its bond releasing its guardian with the same love with which it had claimed her. The hall was full. Every noble house with a seat at the conclave had sent representatives, and those who had not had seats had found reasons to be present anyway, because word traveled, and what was going to happen today was not the kind of thing that could be watched at second hand and understood. The king was already at the ceremonial dais when she entered. He stood in the formal regalia of the conclave, the deep blue coat with its silver borders and the chain of the Vorn line at his throat, and he was looking at the doors when she came through them. Their eyes met across the length of the hall, and something passed between them, something she did not have language for and did not need language for, something that the old text in the stone room would have had a word for, and which she was finally not running away from. She walked the length of the hall, every eye in. The room tracked her. She heard the quality of the silence change as she passed, from the silence of waiting to the silence of witnessing, and she kept her gaze forward and her pace steady, and thought about what she always thought about when things were very difficult, which was simply the next step, and then the one after it. She stopped at the appropriate point before the dais. The ceremony protocol she had memorized specified 7 words, to be spoken clearly, announcing her presence and her willingness. The phrase unchanged across 500 years of use. She opened her mouth to say them. The eagle arrived before she could speak. It came through the high windows of the ceremonial hall, windows that had been open since dawn according to tradition, on wings that seemed too vast for the interior space, and that somehow filled it without overwhelming it, and it swept the length of the hall in a single long pass that stirred the air and the silence in equal measure. And it landed not on the king's shoulder, where it traditionally rested at conclaves, but directly in front of Lena, on the stone floor, where it spread its wings once, fully, in the old gesture of recognition that she had read about in the stone room's book, and never expected to see performed, and then folded them, and bowed its great white head, and made the long musical sound. The hall was absolutely still. There was not a breath of movement from the assembled court. Lena looked at the eagle. She looked at it. With the same quality of attention she had brought to every important document she had ever read. The full and honest attention of someone who understood that some things required to be met properly. And she felt the warmth in her chest expand outward through her entire body, bright and insistent and unmistakable. And she understood that what she was feeling was not separate from what the eagle was doing, and never had been. They were the same motion seen from 2 sides. She said the 7 words. Her voice was steady and clear in the silence of the hall. The eagle stepped forward and settled on her arm. And then, because the old protocol required it, and because it was the most natural thing in the world, despite being the most extraordinary thing that had ever happened in this room, she turned to face the king. He came down from the dais, not with the formal measured steps of ceremony, but with the actual steps of a man closing actual distance. He stopped before her, and looked at her, and the eagle on her arm, with an expression she had no framework for, except the one in the old book's description of the king in the first ceremony, which had used the phrase recognizing what has always been true, and she thought that was not wrong. Lena Ashwood, he said. His voice carried to every corner of the hall. Guardian of the Eagle Royal, blood of the Ashenvale line, woman of this kingdom. He paused. I have a number of things to say to you that are not appropriate for a formal ceremony, and which I will say later. But there is one thing that is entirely appropriate here, and which I will not delay. He looked at her, directly, with all of himself in it. "This kingdom has been without its guardian for too long. I have been without mine for longer than that. I am asking you, formally and before every witness here, to accept what the eagle has offered, and what I, less gracefully, have been attempting to offer since the moment you stood in my study with dust on your shoulder and told me about a ledger." She heard from somewhere in the assembled court the sound of Lady Seraphine Crest making a small controlled sound that contained a great deal. She filed it away for later consideration and kept her eyes on the king. "You used my name without permission," she said. "On the first night. You said Lena." Something moved in his face, the warmth she had learned to recognize. "I did," he said. "I did not mind," she said. "Then or now?" "That," he said very quietly, in a voice that was for her and not the hall, "is the most important thing you have ever said." Then the court erupted, not in the chaotic way of disaster, but in the overwhelming way of something that had been held back and was now released, voices and movement, and the sound of a history rewriting itself in real time. The eagle lifted from her arm and swept upward to the painted ceiling and cried out once, the clear, ringing note she had never heard before today, the one she understood without being told was the sound of completion, of something long sought finally found, and the sound of it filled the stone hall and rang in her chest and her blood and somewhere deeper than either. Cassian took her hand, not with ceremony, with the same quality she had come to recognize in everything he did that was real, which was deliberateness, the action of a man who had thought about what he was doing and was doing it exactly as he meant to. She did not flee from it. She received it. She held it. She thought that the woman in the old book had been right, and she thought it was the rarest thing, and she thought she was very grateful to have spent 7 years in an archival wing becoming exactly the kind of person who could do it. The court celebrated for 3 days, which was traditional for a guardian recognition, and Lena navigated it with the systematic thoroughness she applied to all unfamiliar archival problems. She read the protocol documents and attended the required events and said the appropriate things to the appropriate people and was honest when honesty was required, and diplomatic when honesty was not quite the tool the moment needed, and she found that she was neither as uncomfortable nor as out of place as she had expected, because being visible, it turned out, was not so different from being invisible when you remained exactly yourself in both conditions. The court adjusted. Courts always adjusted. They were organisms built for adjustment, and what they had, witnessed in the ceremonial hall, was unambiguous enough that the adjustments happened quickly, with the particular efficiency of people who can see where the currents have shifted and prefer to be swimming in the right direction. She met, in those 3 days, a number of people she had catalogued, but never encountered directly. Lord Aldrich of the Western Marches, who was 83 and had served under Cassian's father, and who took her hand and held it, and looked at her with eyes that had seen a great deal, and said simply, "Good," which she found the most satisfying compliment she received. Lady Marin of the Coastal Houses, who was sharp and funny, and had apparently been placing private wagers on the eagle's eventual choice for several years, and was very pleased with herself. A young scholar named Petra, who had written a thesis on the dormant guardian bloodlines that no one had taken seriously, and who arrived at Lena's first formal reception, practically vibrating with the specific energy of a person who has been right about something for a very long time, and is only now being permitted to feel it. Lena sought Petra out after the formal proceedings, and they spoke for 2 hours in a corner of the reception hall about bloodline genetics and the latency mechanisms in ancestral power, and Petra's research methodology, and what the future of guardian scholarship might look like now that the subject was no longer purely historical, and it was the best conversation Lena had at any of the 3 days of celebrations, with the possible exception of the one she had with Cassian in the small sitting room off the main gallery on the second evening, which was private and therefore not for counting. Lady Seraphine Crest departed for her family's estate in the southern reaches 2 days after the recognition, and Lena sent her a formal note through the appropriate channels that expressed genuine respect for her considerable abilities and wished her well, because she meant it, and because she had found that the most complete way to end an adversarial relationship was with sincerity rather than triumph. She never knew what Seraphine made of the note. She suspected, based on everything she had observed of the woman, that Seraphine had made something precise and useful of it, as she made precise and useful things of most situations, and that this was not the last time they would encounter each other in the political architecture of the kingdom, and she found she did not mind. That, Elder Tomlin asked her, with the careful neutrality of a man still doing arithmetic, whether she intended to continue her archival duties. She told him she did, as time permitted, because the East Wing's third cataloging ledger system had been in a state of quiet disorder for years, and someone with appropriate training needed to address it, and the expression on his face was the most gratifying thing she had seen all week. What she had not anticipated, in all her reading and all her preparation, was the particular quality of the thing that happened between her and Cassian in the days after the recognition, when the ceremony was over and the court was settling, and they were simply two people in the same rooms talking. She had anticipated the official dimensions of it. She had prepared for the weight and the visibility and the political implications. She had not prepared for the way he asked her questions, the quality of attention he brought to her answers, the particular pleasure of being in a conversation with someone whose mind worked differently from hers and who was genuinely interested in how it worked, the pleasure of disagreeing about things that were worth disagreeing about, the pleasure of finding, in the disagreements, the shape of what they each believed. She had not prepared for the way she was allowed to be quiet around him, and how the quiet was received as what it was rather than as absence. She had spent 7 years in the palace learning that invisibility was the safest option for a woman of her station, and she was discovering, incrementally and with the careful precision she brought to all important discoveries, that being seen by the right person was not the vulnerability she had always treated it as. It was something else. It was something the old book had attempted to describe, and had come, in the end, to that phrase again, receiving love without fleeing. And she thought the author had been very wise to put it that way, because it was not about deserving or not deserving. It was simply about the act of staying in the room. She stayed in the room. She stayed in every room. She held what was offered with both hands, with the steadiness she had spent her whole life building without knowing what she was building it for, and she found that it was enough. More than enough. More than she had known to want. 3 weeks after the recognition, she stood in the lower archives. She had come for a different ledger this time, the 4th cataloging volume of The Reign of Mira the Just, which had been misfiled in a location so deeply wrong that finding it had required a 3-day search and a restructuring of her entire theory about who had been doing the secondary filing in the East Wing for the last decade. She found it behind a volume on hawk migration patterns, which was so exactly what she had expected that she stood for a moment holding it and smiling to herself in the dust and the candlelight and the deep, comfortable silence of a room full of everything that had ever been written down. The eagle found her there. It always found her. She had stopped being surprised by this. It came through a narrow window she would not have believed its wingspan could clear, and it landed on the shelf beside her with the precision of something that had done this 1,000 times. And it made the greeting sound, and she raised her hand and it stepped onto her wrist, and they stood together in the lower archives in the comfortable silence of two beings who had recognized each other before either of them had the language for it. "We are going to be fine," she told it. She did not know if it understood words. She had decided it did not matter. Both of us. The eagle tilted its head. The amber eyes were warm and ancient and entirely certain, in the way that 5 centuries of choosing correctly produces certainty, and it made the low, settled sound of contentment. And Lena Ashwood, guardian of the Eagle Royal, blood of the Ashenvale line, woman of this kingdom, tucked her ledger under her arm, and walked back up through the corridor toward the life she had, by a combination of bad filing and honest speaking, and the grace of a creature that recognized what others overlooked, found her way into. If this story touched your heart, share it with someone who loves epic romance. Tell me in the comments, did you see this ending coming?